Hello, everyone. It's great to be here today. I'm constantly blown away when I hear Rose tell the story, and I'm going to start my timer here. When I hear Rose tell the story about how she came across the Suitcase Project and how it inspired her to think about gathering a group of folks to talk about what's going on at Dick's. Sometimes it's very difficult for me to understand the connections that can be made through my photographs. It always comes back to me that just at heart I'm a photographer and I'm not much more than that. And I realize that it's a lot to be a photographer, but I've always approached my work from the point of view of putting it up on the wall or making it available for people to view and then letting people determine what they think about it. And so this is a classic example of this, and Rose saw something in it and decided to be able to apply it to a situation here in North Carolina. So I want to start by, first of all, really thanking North Carolina Health News and Rose and Elizabeth, who have boundless energy and who are so dedicated to the work that they do, so organized and so wonderful to work with. And I also want to thank all the volunteers today who've helped put this on. And I've been able to meet, for those of you who were here last night, I'm really happy to see you all again. I met some wonderful folks last night, and I feel so welcomed to this area. So here we go. So Silent Voices. So I first heard about the Willard Asylum in the early 1980s when I was driving down from Auburn, New York to Ithaca, New York. And I was with a friend, Tanya Warbitsky, who is an historic preservationist, and she said, "Hey, John, have you ever seen the abandoned buildings on the campus of the Willard Psych Center?" And I never had. And we pulled up into a driveway and drove onto the campus of the functioning psych center, and there was this beautiful building that was built in 1868. And I immediately knew that I wanted to get inside of that building. Like many 19th century New York State psychiatric centers, Willard opened and was closed by the state when the state determined that it wasn't financially viable to keep it running. Willard was built in 1868 with the idea that it would be a home for people with chronic mental illness. In the late 1830s, New York State opened the Utica Asylum, and it was with the idea that people would come there for a period of 2 years. If they weren't cured in that 2-year period, they would be returned to the jail, the county poorhouse, the almshouse, or the private home from whence they came. And it was determined pretty shortly after Utica opened that was not a viable approach to treating people who were mentally ill. So Willard was built and opened in 1868 with the idea that it would be a place for people who suffer from chronic mental illness. And in fact, that's primarily what Willard was throughout its existence. There were periods of time in its history when it functioned as a psych center for people who would come in and be treated and then return back to the community. But by and large, most of the people who were at Willard came there, lived their entire lives there, died there, and were buried across the street. I grew up in Meadville, Pennsylvania, which is a small town in northwestern Pennsylvania, and I lived near the Warren Psychiatric Hospital, the state hospital. And as a child, I remember parents of friends and adults saying to me, "Well, you'd better behave or you're going to end up in North Warren." And I think it was a fairly common thing for people who grew up near psychiatric centers to have that kind of put about them. And growing up, I always had a fascination with buildings and with abandoned spaces. And while I was in college, and I'm happy to say my college friends and roommate, Eric and Gail Vaughn, who are Raleigh residents, longtime Raleigh residents, Eric and I used to spend a bit of time breaking into old buildings and wandering around. So when I saw the Willard building, it took me about a year to get permission from the state of New York to get in and photograph. But I'm going to see if we can do this. Is this working? Pointing it where I should. and we're not having any luck. There we go. Are you changing that, or did I? Okay. So I got into Willard. I was able to photograph. I realized at the time that it was just such a compelling subject. I applied to the New York State Council on the Arts for a grant to photograph 3 other 19th century New York State asylum buildings that were abandoned. These buildings were all abandoned and on the grounds of functioning state psych centers. And that was my initial connection with Willard. And I spent an amazing couple of years photographing, and the exhibit, The Silent Voices, traveled around quite a lot. I suppose now with this whole idea of urban exploration, there are a lot of people who go into old buildings. You see it on the web quite regularly, but it was great. I had permission to do this, and it was a really remarkable experience. In 1995, when Willard was closed, the employees who were actually former employees, these are people who had been laid off, were given the task of going through all 80 of the buildings on the 1,400-acre campus and determine what was to be saved and what was to be thrown into a dumpster and what was to be returned to the state. A woman by the name of Beverly Courtright, who had been a long-term employee at Willard, in fact, she was a third-generation employee, went up into the top floor of one of the many buildings, and she had keys to every door in the institution. She saw this door, and she put the key in and opened the door, and she said that she felt an immediate whoosh of energy come over her. And what she saw in this room, and there's Beverly, were a collection of over 400 suitcases that had been put into this attic starting in 1910, and the collection stopped in 1965. So in 1965, the door was closed and locked up, and the suitcases lived there in this attic for that period of time. Bev knew immediately that there was a compelling reason why she should do something to save them. And fortunately, Craig Williams, who's a curator at the New York State Museum, was contacted by Bev. Within weeks, Craig got a huge truck and came out and picked up all of the suitcases and entered them into the collection, the permanent collection of the New York State Museum. There was a lot of negotiation that had to be done with the New York State Office of Mental Health. All the paperwork was done, and over a period of time, the State Museum curated and put together an exhibit with, I think it was 8 of the suitcases that opened at the New York State Museum in 2004. It featured the stories of some of the patients and featured the actual suitcases themselves. So I had seen the exhibit. I had known from Craig that the suitcases had existed, and right from the start, I had really wanted to get in and photograph the collection. When I first approached Craig, he was very open to the idea, and finally, we were able to work it out in 2011 that I went to the storage facility in Rotterdam, New York, where New York State stores all of its collections. And on the very first day of shooting, I really had no idea what I was going to be doing with the project. I pulled my seamless background out of the storage bag where I kept it. It was very wrinkled, and the first case I put up on the table was Frida B's case. And I realized right then that what I wanted to do was not only document the contents of the suitcases, but I wanted to go through and document the care with which the State Museum had put into cataloging and conserving these materials. So the very first day, I was a little bit surprised because when I opened the first case, this is what I saw. And So the lovely green bathroom set or vanity set was there, but then as I looked into the suitcase itself, I saw that everything was cataloged, numbered, and wrapped in plastic. So I think I was maybe expecting that I would open these suitcases and there would be this beautiful arrangement of these objects that I could photograph. I'm not a studio photographer, and it presented a bit of a problem for me. But I immediately started unwrapping things, and I set up a shot, and I thought, well, this is kind of interesting. We'll see what happens. I worked for a little over an hour photographing this, and then I spent the next 4 hours trying to put things back where they belonged and match the numbers. I realized right away that this was going to be a much bigger project than I had ever expected. But I was fascinated by what was in Frida's case, and it was just a fantastic experience. Very early on, I realized that in order to continue doing this, I really needed help. And I was able to work with a fantastic assistant whose name is Peggy Ross. Peggy has a really clear mind. She helped me in all ways with this project, but especially she helped me to put things away. So I would take things out, set them up, shoot them, and then Peg would immediately start putting things back where they belonged. So at that time I thought, well, I'm not really sure what's going to happen with this, but I ended up running a Kickstarter project that went very well. It was successful. I photographed about 70 of the cases, and then realized pretty early on that this was such a unique collection and I had such an amazing opportunity to document it that I ran a second Kickstarter campaign in order to be able to pay Peg and to pay myself for my time. And I went through and photographed all of the 430 suitcases that exist in the collection. I knew early on that I didn't really want to attach a diagnosis to the patients and the suitcases. I really started seeing right away that these people were much more than just people who were institutionalized for a mental illness. And in fact, I really went in the opposite direction. I purposely did not want to know what was going on with these folks. And when you consider what reasons people were put into psych centers for back in those days, the primary diagnosis was dementia precox, which basically means early dementia. I think the assumption was that we all would become demented at some point in our lives. But looking at the medical records, that is what is written on almost every form. I just wanted to show these few slides quickly because just about 3 weeks ago, I was finally able to get into the New York State Archives and photograph those actual medical records. I've been on a parallel track, creative track, with Dr. Karen Miller, who's a psychiatrist in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Karen got access, she's a poet as well. Karen got access to the collection to write poetry based on the medical records of the patients and the records that the patients wrote themselves. Many of the people that owned the cases kept diaries. So Karen had access to these records, and finally I got in. And I was ambivalent about it to a certain degree, but I got into the archives and was able to photograph. These are Frida's entry records and some of the information that came from her, the original interviews. Frida came somewhat later to the hospital in 1932, but the earlier records were all handwritten. So it's just a fascinating aspect of this whole project. But again, as I said, I wasn't primarily interested in the diagnoses. I've learned so much from people who've seen these photographs and tell me what they mean to them. And the one thing that people have said to me repeatedly, which I honestly never really thought about until the photographs started being exhibited, was that the project seems to have given a life back to the folks who were institutionalized. These folks' lives were changed irrevocably by the fact that they were in an institution, and in an institution for mostly their whole lives. And people have told me that what the project does for them is that it reintroduces these people into a world that was not based on their diagnosis as people having mental illness. And that really means a lot to me, and I really understand that, and I do feel that I've been able to somehow reintroduce these folks back into a world that they had lost at some point. I'm going to go back into slides now. We're going to move along fairly quickly here. I'm running a little bit out of time, but I just want to go through quickly and show slides. One of the reasons why I'm really happy to have brought photographs with me is that you sort of take your chances in presenting images in a room where there's ambient light and they're projected. So it's great that you can all walk outside and take a look at the images and actually see real photographs. I do find even now, I shoot digitally and I edit on a computer, and they're real to me. I look at them on the computer, but when I actually make a print and when I look at that print, it just seems so much more evocative to me. So, my little button here is moving kind of quickly. So, and I'm down to about 4 minutes, so I don't want to take up too much more time. So, you can get a chance to see. This is Frank. Frank came to Willard, or Charles. I'm sorry, Charles came to Willard. These are, people brought with them all papers that were important to them. Charles brought his certificate of naturalization. You saw amazing things that people decided to bring with them when they came to Willard. A good portion of the cases were empty, save for labels that were written by the staff when patients came. The labels had varying amounts of information in them, and even the empty cases, that previous case with the coat hanger and buttons, that to me still was evocative. There's a feeling that I would click the hasps on the suitcases and I would hear that sound and I would open up a case and I would look inside and I would smell the smells and have the feeling of what these people's lives were like. Patients did have access to their possessions when they were at Willard in most cases. In some cases they did not. One of the patients, Flora, was a nurse in Ithaca, and she came to Willard with syringes and drugs and all sorts of things that she obviously didn't have access to. I've been able to meet and talk to a lot of the staff at Willard and a few of the former patients, and I got a really strong sense that there was a great amount of caring between the staff and the patients. Willard was a completely one business town. That business was the asylum. Townspeople and the patients mingled freely. They showed first-run movies at the asylum every week. There's a projection room where every movie is written on the wall in pencil by the projectionist. And Willard was unique in that way, and I think that the connection between the staff and the patients is the main reason why the suitcases were saved. When these folks died and were buried across the road, I think the staff just couldn't bring themselves to throw their objects away. Families were contacted. So in the case of these 430 cases, family members declined to come and pick up the cases or pay for the shipping. You all can understand there was a certain stigma to mental illness at that time, and there still is. I think with any hope, the world is changing for the better in that regard. But it is one of the issues that I have had to deal with. I've had to obscure surnames of all these people. New York State has the most stringent privacy laws that I've come across in the country. They supersede HIPAA laws. I'm not allowed to use surnames of patients. In the cemetery across the street, the patients are buried with numbers. The state of New York basically refuses to release the information who's buried in the cemeteries under the guise of privacy. I've been told repeatedly by Office of Mental Health people that, well, of course, mental illness, there's such a stigma attached. We don't want to embarrass families by the fact that they have family members in Willard. And I think just the opposite is true. I think people have a real interest in finding out about their family members who were in institutions like this. I was completely blown away on Friday when Eric and Gail took me over to the Dix site, and I saw the cemetery. I walked into the cemetery, and I saw names on the graves. And it was heartbreaking to me that in New York State, the Office of Mental Health does everything they possibly can to obscure the names of patients. It's really frustrating and sad. I'm just going to move to, there are a couple more slides. There's actually one more slide that I really want to show. It's a small envelope with a toothpick in it, and I think that's my timer. Thank you. There's a small, if we can keep going, you'll see it. It's just a slide with a toothpick. New York State, the New York State Museum did an amazing thing by conserving these objects. So in this suitcase that I opened was a piece of paper and a toothpick, and each of those had a catalog number, and that was what was there. The State Museum did a remarkable thing by preserving these objects and by taking such good care of them. So this was the quick tour, 20 minutes. I really appreciate you all listening. I'll be around. I love to talk about this project. Please come up to me with questions. And there are a lot of questions. This project evokes a lot of questions that really can't be answered in some ways, but in other ways we can all surmise. So thank you all very much. I appreciate your attention, and thanks.
Lives on the Hill is a production of UNC-TV in association with North Carolina Health News. Funding for Lives on the Hill is provided by the financial contributions of viewers like you, who invite you to join them in supporting UNC-TV. Additional funding is provided by Dix Park Conservancy, NAMI North Carolina, the City of Raleigh, Health Decisions Resources, and by the following.